From the heartland of America and coast to coast, this is EM Student with Professor Dan Scott.
Wisdom is not a product of schooling, but the lifelong attempt to acquire it. Albert Einstein. And that was a new introduction for me, so first time hearing it, so it was kind of cool. Thanks, Todd, for doing that for me. Welcome to EM Student. This is Dan Scott. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Today we are going to, let's welcome on first my co-host, Franzi Economy. Welcome, Franzi. Come on. Good morning, Franzi. Happy St. Patrick's Day. How are you doing today? You got your green on?
I don't.
I don't either, and I'm saying, I'm all happy about it, and I don't even have green on today. I'm hoping somebody's gonna pinch me. You pinch me. That's, I don't think anybody's smart or brave enough to do that, to be honest with you. But so you're hiding away in your room, so it's no big deal, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, today's a great show. We're gonna have Dr. Feldmann-Jensen, who is one of the Shirley Feldmann-Jensen, and she is in some accomplices to talk about that. So can we bring on our guest, Dr. Jensen?
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for that introduction, Daniel. Although we missed it, it buffered out.
No, I'm sorry. Technical difficulties on St. Patrick's Day. How you doing this morning?
I am well. Looking forward to getting out of my bedroom.
Yeah, well, we just in our county, we just transitioned. We just transitioned today. Actually, we're transitioning from purple to red, which was good news for us. Yesterday, we got some good news. So hopefully, we'll start to build out and be able to get out more and start to actually socialize more. So hopefully, that's coming.
Yeah, I hope everybody has a safe, happy St. Patrick's Day, because we still are in danger.
Agreed.
COVID's still very real. Just because we're coming out of it, don't mean that we got to let our guard down, which is it's something we got to keep reminding everybody, right? Just because we're coming out of it a little bit and things are starting to improve, that doesn't mean we can let our guard down. We still got to keep our guard up and be safe.
And that's the perfect segue into the topic I would like to talk about today, is core competencies and why we need them so much, because the competencies affect our future workforce development. And as we are seeing, after having a year long of multiple layered crises and ongoing crises, our workforce is really stressed and really tired, and some are even burned out. And we have to think about developing our future workforce so that it is prepared to help build continued resilience in our communities and to build our workforce in a way that they are prepared for a challenge, the multifaceted challenges that our current situation is evolving into, very dynamic and continued growth and disasters.
I completely agree.
I was going to say, thanks so much for kind of teeing up the topic that we're going to talk about today. I wonder actually if we could start with some bit more general questions, both for me, obviously, as I'm learning, and for our listeners. If you could maybe just talk about a little bit in general, what are core competencies, what do we use them for, what's the purpose, and how they might kind of differ from some other competencies that we might hear kind of talked about in the emergency management education space.
Yes. Core competencies were originally characterized, and I'm going to quote, the collective learning in the organization. And unlike physical assets, which deteriorate over time, competencies are enhanced and applied and shared. And that was by Prahalad and Hamill in 1990 out of Harvard. They were the first ones to define what a core competency was. They noticed it in the business world. A more current description of core competencies embodies collective learning that integrates and coordinates the diverse skills and invests in the strategy that unifies the wider professional community. So in other words, we need to equip future emergency managers to foster more resilient communities and to be able to cope with multiple layers of the unexpected. So core competencies are ones that are relevant to all people at all levels of service. And I need to point out that when we talk about these broader core competencies, it's unrealistic to expect it in one person, that rather it's much more of a team approach, that we want to be cognizant of the competencies when we're building our team so that we have a full spectrum represented. There are multiple kinds of competencies that cause a lot of confusion on the topic. And for example, the National Response Framework has a lot of competencies that they identify for us to train and exercise to. Those are technical competencies. Then earlier below that, we have foundational competencies. They are fundamental proficiencies. Those are the things we learn in our primary school and secondary school, and even in our early undergrad. It's just refining our oral and written communications, our basic mathematics, so we can attend to the finances of the organization and things like that. So those are foundational. All things are built on those. You can't enter a professional world without math and communication skills. The core competencies equip future emergency managers to foster more resilient communities, as I said, and to deal with the unexpected events. But as we prepare those competencies, those inform how we develop our education around that and prepare the workforce. The technical competencies are more specific to the function in the distributed functions of emergency management, because not all people have the same role in the broader scope of emergency management. It's distributed functions. And so those are the ones like we see in the National Response Framework competencies that we're training to. They are important for accomplishing tasks and the objectives, but the core competencies underlie that. They are more basic. But then as you grow in your administrative levels and in your expertise in emergency management, the core competencies come essentially to play in the leadership components and the civics components and understanding how to engage the community.
Yeah, I think that was one of the really fascinating things I found kind of looking through some of the documentation that talks about the different core competencies and really how they are explicitly outlined at kind of every different level of study, from undergraduate to graduate to doctoral, or, and you can obviously then parlay that into, different levels of experience when you're actually practicing emergency manager. And so I just thought that was really great to kind of see that they are applicable at all levels, and they kind of stay as you grow in the profession.
Yes, and that's in, I'd like to point out that's a great aspect to point out, Franzi, is that whether you're doing it academically and you're learning these academically and how to apply them, and you can also apply that to the practitioner from beginner to expert in what how they're applied and learned as well. Learned then applied. As far as and as you pointed out, if you're lucky enough to have a team, one person isn't going to be doing all this because there's so many aspects of it. But one of the key aspects I'd like to point out here is that when it comes to these core competencies, there's a behavioral aspect versus a technical knowledge. There's a behavioral aspect of it, and I'll leave that to Dr. Jensen to describe.
Okay, so when the competencies were identified and vetted by the broader emergency management community and refined, the last step was to develop measures to how do these competencies influence our education, how do they influence practice, and how can we measure that? Back in the 1960s, Smith and Kendall identified a way of observing behaviors and actions that could be conducted as some basic measures for assessing and being more objective rather than subjective. And so behavioral anchors were defined for each competency, and the under the behavioral anchors, then there were key actions that you could observe and make it easier to note in the evaluation of whether they were achieved in education or in practice. And so they can be applied quite easily. And I think a lot of these kind of behavioral anchor measures are already used in a lot of assessments in the workplace environment.
Yeah, that's one thing I really I noticed as I was reading through and really liked. I think sometimes a lot of the materials that I'm reading when I'm learning about emergency management talk about these kind of really broad, big, overarching goals about how we're trying to accomplish what we want in the field. But I really liked how this really broke it down to these very actual the things that you can work on, throughout your education or while you're volunteering, or obviously if you get a job and you're working in the field. And they are actually very concrete, different tasks or kind of things that will then relate back to the overall kind of bigger concept and help you kind of develop those softer skills. I wonder if you might, be able to talk to us about, so it was interesting that you mentioned that the original core competencies were developed in 1990. And now obviously they've kind of went through a refresh more generally. And so I wonder if you could talk about kind of how they support the development of the future workforce. You kind of touched on that already with trying to make sure that emergency managers are resilient themselves and equipped to handle anything that might get thrown at them. But I wonder if you might talk a little bit more about that.
Sure, certainly. The core competencies can be viewed like a tree. I like to use the metaphor of a tree. So the core competencies are the roots and the trunk. And then the behavioral anchors that you're looking for when you're assessing are the branches. And then the leaves and the fruit are really the knowledge, skills, abilities, or capabilities that are measured in technical skills. And so as we look at the purpose for core competencies, one is to guide education in the development of our curriculums to prepare the workforce for future needs. And so we're looking at risk drivers and the things that are going to influence our communities in the disaster scape. For example, the context of risk patterns and risk and disaster trends are growing. And then the context of the interactions between the natural, built, and social environments are the basic things that the late Dr. Maletti had brought to everybody's attention and has become foundational in our emergency management theory. And some of those interactions we're seeing right now are environmental stress, resource depletion, changing biodiversity. We have infrastructure issues. Our demographics are changing and moving to the coast and to more disaster-prone areas, risk-prone areas. And then we have changing information flow where we're all interconnected, interdependent. So those things work together in a very dynamic way that create and drive risk and increase. That's why we are seeing increased disaster occurrences and increased risk. And so as we're considering that has to be embedded into the core competencies to prepare our future workforce. And all that affects our curriculum. And we're learning more about that when we're interfacing with existing emergency managers who are giving us feedback and giving us information. And we create a feedback loop so that we can continually improve this. The competencies provide that measure for that feedback loop, and we can get the information to our colleagues in the field, and our colleagues in the field can get it back to us in education, and the researchers come into that loop too, and they help change and advance the knowledge space that we have. I'm not sure if I got to your question or not.
Yeah, no, I think it all speaks to the kind of evolving nature of emergency management. And I think I think as you very rightly pointed out, obviously our environment changing and how the environment interacts with the built world changing, all of those things that kind of, we have to be willing to adapt, much like in the, smaller version of an actual disaster or emergency we're responding to, kind of in the overarching, profession and how we operate in the world. Obviously we have to be able to adapt as things change around us. I guess I also was curious. So you've now mentioned a few times how these core competencies are used in education. So in developing programs for new emergency managers to make sure that they have, some skills in each of these different areas, as well as being able to evaluate people on the professional level. But I wondered what advice you might give to an emergency management student who's following a path a bit more like myself. I'm obviously not in a kind of bachelor's degree program or master's degree. I'm pursuing more a certificate, and then as well as kind of looking into some trainings. And it's a little bit more of like a self-guided approach. And so I guess I'm curious how a student like me could potentially take some of these core competencies and just make sure that I'm putting them into practice, making sure that I'm getting those different areas, and what advice you might give.
Well, I do want to make you aware that your the self-guided path and some of the trainings you're going through are the technical competencies.
Okay.
Specifically to distributed functions and tasks and objectives, where the core competencies need to underline that. And that's really important for fueling your future. When you have that core and you're keeping your core healthy, if we're talking about your own person, you need to think about your learning in the same way. You need a core of skills or competencies that are holistic, that feed to all the technical competencies. And you will find that the technical competencies will be so much more, you'll have so many more aha moments and more depth when you have the core underneath it to attach it.
Interesting.
Some of the competencies, there are 13 competencies, and your first one, you're back to your earlier question, you talked about the early identification in the 90s in the business world that these core competencies existed and were defined. Then in the early 2000s, shortly thereafter, Dr. Wayne Blanchard identified a specific set of core competencies for emergency management in the earlier days. Those competencies were folded into this, and really those came into the first core competency that was identified, which is that emergency management professional is proactive, anticipatory, innovative approach for guiding public policy and the application of emergency management framework. And you will see his principles everywhere. If you're at the National Emergency Training Center, that emergency management activities need to be comprehensive, progressive, risk-driven, integrated, collaborative, coordinated, flexible, and professional. Now, those specific pieces that were competencies in the early days have become behavioral anchors because they're much more behavioral. But we're defining, we're still keeping that in there because it's so critical, the body of knowledge that we already have accumulated, we've grown. And so that all folded into one core competency, but we realize we need much more. I can briefly go through the 13 competencies so you know what they are, and then you can see how they are broader to undergird your technical learning.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So critical thinking. An emergency manager must possess critical thinking. And we've divided them into different layers of embedded, nested layers of competencies. The first layer is competencies that build the individual. So you're speaking about building yourself as an emergency manager. So the first four are around building yourself. And that's the ones we talked about earlier, the professional emergency management and body of knowledge that we have. Possessing critical thinking, abiding by professional ethics, and continual learning. And so you're already demonstrating the continual learning by the things you're doing, and certificate programs are a good way to build stackable credentials in your field. And then at some point you may want to be able to take those certificates and fold them into a degree. But those are the things you're looking for personally. If you're wanting to build your professional, the practitioner part, there have been areas in education that you need a basic literacy. Just like to be literate in writing, you need a basic scientific literacy, geographic literacy, where you understand how hazards and vulnerability interact with the built physical and social environments. Sociocultural literacy, we're always working with stakeholders and people of every description, and we need to understand the human being's behaviors so we can change risk behaviors. Technological literacy, as we know, we're in a crisis with cyber security issues, and so to have a basic understanding of evolving technologies is really relevant to our practice. And systems literacy, where we can gain the whole picture, particularly in the interactions and the patterns of these relationships for change. So those are the things that build practitioner. And then finally, the last few competencies build relationships. The competency around disaster risk management is disaster risk awareness, assessment, measurement, and reduction across a broad spectrum of stakeholders. Community engagement is another competency for building relationships, where we need to be able to facilitate community ownership of risk. Governance and civics, unfortunately, we aren't so strong on governance and civics anymore in our secondary education. And so it is a must to really understand the civic and legal processes from politics to policy in the work we do as emergency managers. And finally, leadership. The emergency management professional needs to be comfortable to lead both within and across organizations. And of course, as I said before, these competencies are not fully available. It's unrealistic to think that one person can have all of that, but we look at this as a team. We should all have strengths and weaknesses and a little bit in each of these areas, but some people are going to be stronger than others, and we should build teams around those strengths.
Yeah, and that's a good point, and that's one of the things I'm an advocate about is with understanding the self-development, understanding the job, understanding what is going to be required of you as a person, mentally, physically, emotionally, doing it as an emergency manager. And that's one of the reasons why these core competencies are so important to understand, is that, and you mentioned it when we first started, that there's burnout, right? We have a level of burnout that's taking place because this crisis that we've been in has been in over a year now, and there's ultimately a level of self-care. And by the more you know, the more you understand, the more you're able to handle, the better you are at handling it, especially when it's when it drags out for as long as it has. On top of we have COVID, plus we have fires, and we have wind events, and we have hurricanes, and you build those on top of and having these core competencies and understanding how to work within them, how to work with others, how to lead is a big aspect that we want to show, that we want to promote within, to learn, to develop, because it's a skill that can be invaluable in these situations, and especially as we continue to work our way out of COVID. But there's always what's right around the corner. Even though as we're working around what could happen next, and we got to be ready for it. And so that's one of the reasons why I appreciate these core competencies so much, and one of the reasons why we wanted to have you on the show to describe
the multi-layered disasters and events that are going on are really critical. And as you talked about the burnout, it indicates that we have not developed enough workforce in the emergency management arena. And therefore, these competencies become even more vital as we prepare a future workforce and current workforce to expand it, because we're having a growing need for this.
And it's one of those things that has been an issue since I walked into emergency management, is the need for more than one person doing the job. I mean, you usually have one person's job versus a team of individuals that come together to do this job and prepare and the community and work through an incident with all together, promoting the community, coordinating, supporting. And it's what we don't see enough of. And I do see that there is a growing trend right now that people are developing these positions for their organizations, but they're only still hiring one person that they feel one person is going to be enough to do this. And it's not, instead of building a full department, they're building a position. Well, a position needs to lead to a department, which needs to lead to a program and organization level system of thinking when it comes to emergency management versus, well, we need to hire somebody to do this for us. Well, it's not a one-person job. And even though one person may be coming in, they're going to be heavily reliant on the individuals they work with to help them.
And in many communities, it's a half a person job.
Yes, I agree. Other duties as assigned. Yes.
And having competing demands. Yes.
Resources is always going to be an issue, but I feel like we're getting to a point to where there's going to be even more argument for funding the positions and the programs, which have to be put in place to limit the amount of loss of not only jobs but property and life and everything that goes along with it. The more they invest in the upfront aspect of mitigating and preventing these things, the less the consequence is going to be. And I feel like we're just starting to go up that hill. We've been kind of just going like this, and I feel like we're just getting ready to go up that hill and start those battles.
So Francie asked an important question about how does someone like her build her competencies when she's not going through a specific degree program, but she's building it through multiple sources and certificates and trainings. It's useful to get that handbook of measures, and the link is provided, and we can provide the other materials as well.
Mm-hmm.
But the handbook of measures gives you the questions and the measurements, as you said, they're quite specific to actions and the content that you need. So you can ensure that you get that in the trainings and the one-off courses that you are taking as your individual choice. And at some point, I know some education communities are already switching to stackable credentials and going to competency-based education, but that's a long way off before it becomes generalized. But you can be looking for that too.
Okay, great. Yeah, to kind of use that outline that's in those materials kind of as a way to, build and kind of decide which certificates to look into. And also, I think it's also really helpful to obviously being on this show, and also just I've been doing this anyway, but trying to talk to lots of different emergency managers in the field, all of whom have lots of different opinions and ideas and context, really, because that's what I see. A lot of these core competencies, it feels like a lot of context and kind of lenses through which to view the profession. So I've actually, obviously gotten a lot out of this conversation, gotten a lot out of a lot of other conversations I've had. So that would also be, something that I would encourage anybody to do, is to really talk to practicing emergency managers about these different core competencies, and how they apply them, how they learned them, just to kind of get going on some of that as well.
And I would like, this doesn't necessarily apply to students, but because students are preparing in a new playing field, and existing emergency managers sometimes look at these core competencies and get threatened, but they already have developed expertise. This is about the core competencies are to inform the development of a future workforce. And that's why it's so relevant to students.
Yeah, and I agree. So, but I want to give you opportunity as well, because we're gonna make a lot of this information available to the public. But where can, if someone's listening, where can they find you, Dr. Jensen, and the information that you provided here today? Is there an area they can go look for it and collect it?
Yes, I'm an instructor in the Emergency Services Administration at California State University Long Beach, and you can find me through our website, and you can download the handbook of I forget exactly what we call it. Let me find the term. At FEMA Higher Education Program, you can get the Next Generation Core Competencies for Emergency Management Professionals, Handbook of Behavioral Anchors and Key Actions for Measurements. It's available free. You can download it. Additionally, there's been articles about workforce development around the core competencies through the UN ISDR, and now it's UNDRR, Disaster Risk Reduction Agency. And we have published the article in the Journal of Emergency Management. And I believe that article from 2019, in January 2019, that whole edition is free and open source.
Very good, and I highly encourage it. I mean, I have it in a binder, so it's great information. It's great for research. It's great for just learning. It's not necessarily one of those things you're like, oh, I'm going to go read about this. No, but it's great for information. It's great for your personal development, as we promote here on EM Student. Lifelong learning, continual learning. I mean, there's always need to keep up to date on things, and it's always need to continue to remember why it's important that you started doing what you're doing and why you want to do what you want to do, especially with our transitions in and our new students that are coming out of school or interning or wanting to develop their foot in the door for emergency management, to continue to learn, look for these resources, and more than just having them and putting them in a binder and putting them on your desk, read them, understand them, and apply them. So I wanted just to
pointed out, and as Francie pointed out, it's really important to just know them for yourself, so you can say, am I achieving this? Do I know, is this competency existing in me?
I agree. And Franzi, and I want to say thank you to Franzi as I start to close out the show. Thank you to Franzi. She's our EM student. She's our our audience. So she came today with some great questions and general general desire to learn this aspect of things. She did a lot of research prior to the show, so that's our EM student. That's why we brought Franzi on, is because she's our audience. And thank you for Franzi for coming in and co-hosting and asking those great questions. Thank you, Shirley, for coming in, spending your time with us. I tell everybody that your time is the most valuable thing you can give anyone, and you gave some to us today, and I truly appreciate that, especially bringing in your expertise and describing all the work you did. And I can second the fact that it's very valuable, and I look forward to what comes next. I work with you in the ethics committee and developing a code of ethics for the profession, and there's a lot coming for emergency management, and I feel like we're out. And I keep saying, I'm going to keep saying it. I'm going to say it more and more. I feel like we got to stop using the fact that emergency management, stop saying that we're in our infancy. Let's get outside of our infancy. Let's get outside of our comfort zone. Let's start growing. I'm gonna end the show by saying, go find us on LinkedIn, EM Student, EM Weekly. Go on our website. Go on SitchRadio.com for the shows. We have 14 other shows on there on Sitch Radio. Go on Facebook and find us, EM Weekly. We're going to actually be opening up probably starting a EM Student group to go along with that page. Go on find us on Crisis Cafe if you'd like to know more about Crisis Cafe. If you need a link as an invitation, reach out to us. We can send you that link. We're also hosting book club. So it's a month-long book club, and you can get on there. And if you go on Crisis Cafe, sign up through Crisis Cafe, you get half off. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Dan Scott, and we'll talk to you soon.
Have you ever wanted to work in a flying ICU? LifeSave is currently hiring flight nurses and medics to join our air medical team. Check out our amazing salary and benefits packages. Visit airmethods.com/careers and apply today.